everyone, Aaron here from A2Z Strength, and welcome to the A2Z Strength Show. This is episode 5 with Dr. Trevor Kashey. Now, I got on to, or actually heard about Dr. Kashey on the book The Comfort Crisis from Michael Easter, and I recommend you guys reading that if you haven't before. It's an unreal book, and the way that Trevor was depicted in this book really intrigued me. He's a biochemist and nutritional guru, as well as a strongman. So he runs a nutritional based business, but when you think of a nutritionist or a dietitian as such, you kind of think of meal preps, meal plans, and just food guidance. Whereas this is not what Dr. Kashey's about. He's all about the brain and how we interfere with how we trying to get to certain goals or certain outcomes. And he approaches the brain in a very unique way, and it really is a testament to, I guess, the results that he gets based off his approach. And that's why I think I wanted to get him on, because he is so unique with the way he thinks about things, that his approach and his business model matches, and the results he gets is amazing. He's worked in the Olympic setting as well, so he worked for the Azerbaijan Olympic Team, and the story that came about him working for them is unbelievable. It could be made into a movie. It's that crazy. His thought process and the way he articulates things in terms of when it comes to us trying to work towards a goal, motivation, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic motivation cues, is unbelievable. It's really going to make you think, and his quirky delivery really kind of resonates with a lot of people because it's kind of real, and he's real and authentic, which is why I wanted to get him on as well. Now, this is probably not going to go the way that you would think when it comes to talking to someone that runs a nutrition-based business, but I promise you it's going to be unbelievable. The takeaways I've got from this, and just within my own goal setting, within my own kind of behavior modification, is going to be invaluable, and I'm going to be using this from this day forward. So you'll get a lot out of this, so hang tight and just enjoy where this goes, because it goes into multiple different directions, which is why I like these conversations. So without further ado, this is Dr. Trevor Kashey. Enjoy. So I first came across you in Michael Easter's book, The Comfort Crisis. And I absolutely love that book. So if anyone hasn't read that, I highly recommend it. But the depiction of you was awesome in it. And just the way that, I guess, the message that you, or the way you deal with your clients is quite a unique way. And I was just wondering, in terms of, you put a lot of emphasis on the psychological side of things with your clients and in your work. My question is, how did you come to that point rather than focusing more, say, on like the diet or the program side of things?
What an interesting question. And I will tell you the exact truth. After starting with like machine, robot, freakish, high achiever type people kind of on accident with a background in, have a background in biochemistry and moved into strength sports. And I'm pretty sure Easter covered that in the book. And I traveled overseas and worked across the world with a few hundred Olympic athletes for the Rio de Janeiro Olympics for most of the cycle, and quite a few people that had interesting medical conditions. And so I got spoiled by people that would just follow recommendations. And so people presented data, I looked at the data and then presented a straightforward approach, and people of that caliber just say, okay, and they follow through. And when I moved back to the United States and I started working with real people more, rather than people who like get a gold medal or I chop your head off type people, the implications started changing, and especially as I started to work with children a little bit, et cetera. And I had a few interesting cases where I knew from the biology / physiology sort of fundamental science background, I felt comfortable that I gave good enough sort of directives, and I use that word specifically. And I started getting kickback, I suppose, in the form of like, your plan doesn't work. This doesn't work. And at first I found it very insulting and then sort of confusing, because some people say the laws of physics equal the laws of physics equal the laws of physics. And really it came down to what I provided them deviated from what they thought they would get, and what they did to make good on the directions I gave differed from how I gave directions. And so it actually put it on me as a professional or practitioner, or whatever you want to label me at this point in time, as how do I communicate this stuff in a way that increases efficacy for them. Because if you give somebody directions and they say that doesn't work, it gets real easy to label other people as resistant or lazy or unmotivated or whatever the sort of terms people use right now, when in reality, it falls on me as the professional to communicate it in an effective way. And so that very fast, and working with children as well, took me down a path of how do I kind of communicate this information in an effective way. And once I got into that, I guess you call it the psychological side, so we'll follow there, that people have real life problems, man. And very fast, I recognized that people already know to eat more vegetables. People already know to walk around the block. People already know to sleep more. People already know all this stuff, Mr. Zimmerman. And they have this big gap. We all have this big gap between intention and intervention, the stuff we want to do and the stuff it takes to get it. And so a lot of people put emphasis, clients, coaches, experts, et cetera, they put huge emphasis on getting the outcome. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish? Goal, 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 goal. And pretty early on, I started taking goals and throwing them in the garbage because I realized people had more problems to solve. So I started developing this analogy with people, and I'll share it with you, that a lot of people will hit the gas. They really want to hit the gas. They want more horsepower. I like to use a car analogy because it seems to fit at least Americans pretty well. People want to slam on the gas when they got their foot on the brakes, man. And if we already get emotional talking about this, so if we take the position that people already know what to do, and they really do, that they have things getting in their way of doing it, rather than they do the wrong stuff on purpose because they are dumb or they are not educated or whatever people tend to say. The typical fit pro saying eat vegetables, walk around the block and exercise, to someone who already knows those things really acts more condescending, in my opinion. And so by taking the approach of, well, if people already know to do this, what prevents them from doing those things? It ends up changing the approach of working with other humans in a very big way, because I can set aside goals because people already have their goals. They already know what to do. And if I help open the door for them so they can walk through it, the rest of the stuff ends up taking care of itself. And as I worked with people in between, like professional athletes, so to speak, that had family lives, et cetera, versus like working in other countries with people who just lived in a barracks, so to speak, or actually lived in a barracks, that when you help other people open those doors, you help focus on the constraints rather than everything you could possibly do to enhance and optimize. Like you can wear the best shoes and have a super high VO2 max and run the race with your shoes tied together. And I found that lots of people, I already get like see me already worked up. A lot of people operate like that, man. And so I take the position that if you just untie the damn shoelaces, the rest takes care of itself. And this helps people of all education levels, proficiencies, competencies, whatever term you want to use, experiences, that the most experienced people, they overlook the basics sometimes as much as the virgin overlooks the basics out of ignorance.
Yep.
And just by going back and focusing on those fundamental things, what sort of limiting factors do you have in your life that interrupt you from just doing the basics in a more violent way in as many places as possible? Once you address those sort of factors, the goals end up taking care of themselves. One, because people will still reach them. And two, you find out that when you help people resolve problems in their lives, their goals often change. And so a person that comes in wanting to look a specific way, run a specific speed, whatever, we can help them with that. And we do, trainers do. If you help people address the other things going on in their lives that interfere with running faster, getting leaner, lifting more weights, etc., they might give two shits about losing weight after. And so now
it will last for a longer time.
Yes, correct. And so now they start doing things for different reasons, which some people might call intrinsically motivated, I suppose, if you subscribe to that sort of self-determination theory style language, that now the reasons that they do things change. They do it for some, what some people might call carrot and stick or external reason. And their mode of operating actually starts getting more and more here, more and more internal. And sometimes people retain the same goals and then just rocket ship forward because now we've taken care of all their limitations or the big limitations, the biggest bang for a buck limitations, to make it diplomatic. And other people realize, well, I actually would rather do something else. so many professional athletes, high level competitors, that once you help reconcile just things in their lives that get in the way of taking them to the next level, they realize that they focused so hard on their sport because they had other things going on in their lives that made them miserable. And because they excelled in the sport, say triathlons or CrossFit or powerlifting, et cetera, like that really have strong amateur, a large, strong amateur competitive base that have really limited opportunity for income. I'll just say that from the sport itself, that lots of people who excel in those areas, if they have other stuff going on in their lives, they'll end up focusing more and more on this other sport because they win. It feels good. They get some positive reinforcement. They see progression in their life. Meanwhile, the more they excel here in this part of their life, the more this other stuff in their life starts to fester, and it interferes with this more and more. And you get this interesting feedback loop where they keep hitting the gas harder and harder and harder on their sport. And the more they hit the gas on their sport, the more they improve, the more these parts of their life suffers. And then you start getting this revving the engine in park sort of situation. And if you help resolve this sort of stuff, then some of them go on to turn legitimate professional and start making their living doing this sport. And other people realize that, well, I had all these things in my life that made me feel miserable. And now that I've taken care of these, I can actually have fun doing this thing. And so hopefully that gives you sort of an idea of how and why I deviated that direction in the context of really just providing a better product rather than obsessing over the pedantic nature of like, do I take my extra bite of chicken after my third set of leg extensions at the vernal equinox or whatever the hell people argue about right now. So hopefully that gives you an idea that I still maintain that even the top performing people benefit from focusing on the basics.
And I totally resonate with that. Like from my experience too, working in pro sport and high performance coaching, early on in my career, I put so much emphasis on the strength and conditioning side of things. And I now realize that whole kind of philosophy is so flawed because the psychological motives or drives that brings an athlete to you far outweigh whatever you prescribe to them, and trying to figure out what's going on in their life, trying to actually find out those key drivers in them, or the psychological drivers, whether that's at home as a person. All of those things are hugely important in terms of for me to understand in the way that I coach. So that's been a massive paradigm shift for me as well. 100%
agreed.
Was it a hard paradigm shift, I guess, for your clients or the people you work with to actually get a grasp of this? Because the traditional model was you go and see someone like yourself and you just prescribe a diet plan or just a training program, to then have all of this other shit be thrown at them. Was it quite hard at first for people to actually be able to take that all on board?
Very few had an issue with it. I mean, I would actually argue the opposite, that a vast majority of people took to it in a big way, man.
Because it was different?
I get worked up real easy about this stuff. Sorry.
No,
people know when you give a shit.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay. And a lot of them compete in these sports, if we want to stick in this area, because they want attention, affection, and approval. You do things so that you can accomplish stuff. And when you accomplish stuff, you get benefits for that, right? And so a lot of different things happen, but really excelling at a sport has a ton of social benefits. And the issue that you bring up has more to do with addressing roadblocks as they arise, rather than transplanting this whole, like, I'll just call it psycho-behavioral or whatever methodology on top of people in the very beginning. It really functions as an ad hoc sort of paradigm where a person comes in with a particular goal or problem or whatever, and we have the discussion and we collaborate on a plan, and then we both okay it. And when they start on the plan, they just bring up when stuff gets in the way. And then the stuff that gets in the way, we can lump into two basic categories. We can lump them into a practical problem, which you can describe as an education issue, a skill issue, an environment issue, just practical stuff that they can do right now to resolve it and move on, right? And then you also have what you might call emotional problems, where other stuff occurs that maybe beliefs they have, or turbulence in other relationships, or superstitions, things of that nature actually interfere with them adhering to the plan as indicated. And so when it comes to adhering to a plan, if you deviate, well, then you assess based off of their feedback, how and where did you deviate? And that will give you an idea of whether we have a practical issue or frankly an emotional one, or psychological, or whatever you want to label this sort of category. I kind of lump everything into behavior these days. So, and also a lot of people will take a practical problem and then they will upgrade it into an emotional problem, for instance, out of frustration. If you have a difficult workout and somebody struggles and they fail during the workout, they might say, I'm an idiot. I'll never do this again. I suck. Dr. Kashey's an idiot. I'm talking to somebody else for a new plan. And now you have this practical issue that you could solve, for instance, maybe for sleeping an extra hour, or hydrating a little more, or modifying the temperature in the room, or pacing the session different, an issue that they could have solved, or we could have solved by practical means, that they upgrade into an emotional problem because of their explanatory style of the issue. And so these sort of things end up interacting, which a lot of people confuse with like, they get demotivated. And really, they encountered a frustration, which I define as an event that interferes with you getting what you want. And how they assess that frustration, essentially how they describe it to themselves and to you, will then give you an idea of whether they upgraded into an emotional problem or psychological problem, or whether they realize they have a practical issue that they can resolve with a simple or rather straightforward change. And so these things do often feed off of each other, and you get second, third, fourth, fifth order emotional problems. So you can have stress at work, then you can get in arguments with your wife, and then the arguments with your wife drive you to drink, and then the drinking causes weight gain, and then you come to me for weight gain when really you got stress at work. And so you have all of these literal orders of problematic issues. And do you have to get to the root? No, different monster. Although if you want to help a person improve their performance, I just take the position that we take the limiters first. And if you use your goal and your goal-oriented behavior as a way to get away from something bad in your life, you'll end up hitting the gas while you ride the brake at the same time, and that leads to what I guess what some people call burnout. And so I like to describe that sort of methodology that you have all the tools that it takes to improve, and quite frankly, it makes it obvious that other things going on in your life limit your performance. And I would much rather assess those things before you get into supplements or strange exercise programming or other sorts of stuff. And you can just overlook a lot of those things, I suppose, when you work with I'll just call it a legitimate professional athlete, where they actually act like professionals and realize that they perform as their job. And so they actually have a lot of that sort of stuff managed, or rather, they feel okay if that stuff actually falls apart anyway. And so you still have different coaching priorities for the athlete that performs to put food on the table. It takes a little bit different of an approach initially, and you help them resolve more practical problems than psychological ones. And you have to more modify how if they end up creating some sort of distorted beliefs on their own, like they start demanding I must do this or else I'll fail and I'll get fired or whatever, that sort of stuff that you can manage through, conventional pop psychology framing methods, I suppose. And very few something happened to me at the office, and so I left early and went to train and then hurt myself and blah. And so that sort of stuff, you just have a different set of issues. So insofar as did people take to it, I would say a vast majority of people did take to it very well. And the rest, as in like the people that fed themselves and their families with professional sport, they just used it less because they had a lot of that stuff taken care of. And it really ended up coming into play when they started to transition out of competing at a high level. So a lot of it comes into play there, of the equal opposite of like, now, okay, how do I manage my physique and my training and my diet and my other lifestyle factors and all this extra time I spend with my family? So you actually have an equal opposite sort of issue of now of integrating yourself back into the sort of normal world stuff. Now, do I get another job? And then the other sort of methodologies apply, because now you have these new and strange limiters for this person that just excelled in a perfect world situation.
If you're willing to expand on that, what did you actually kind of, I guess, systems and procedures did you instill in those athletes who were going back to quote unquote the real world? Would be quite interesting.
Oh man. A lot of the professional athletes I've worked with various sports.
Oh, actually, just to expand, Dr. Kashey, I guess the level of athletes you work with and kind of what environment.
So phrase that again, and frankly, your accent hurt. Like I had problems with your accent a little bit. So
that's fine. It's the New Zealand accent.
Yeah. Well, I love it. I just had tough.
It's we're famous for mumbling.
Okay. Oh, well, I mean, an angry American would call it mumbling. I just speak a different language than you.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to, just for the audience, sorry, if you could expand on the environment that you worked in. I know it was the Olympics, I guess, the athletes you worked at, I guess the environment just in and around that.
So overseas, funny enough, they actually offered to like put me up in a fancy penthouse sort of apartment thing at the top of a skyscraper. And I opted to live with the athletes. So I lived with them instead because I had all sorts of interesting responsibilities as a physiologist, I'll just call it that. And they lived more or less in a barracks. They lived in a hotel that got purposed for professional athletes. And so they lived in a 10-story building.
Which country was this?
At the time, Azerbaijan. Yeah. So they lived in essentially a modified hotel, and they had a big cafeteria at the top, and then just dorms all the way down. And they had a cleaning crew, and they had all the typical sort of amenities that a hotel would have. It just filled with 300 plus fighters of varying disciplines. And we had lights out at a specific time. At least they did when I showed up. That garnered some interesting whining.
Some pushback.
A little bit, yes. Real cranky when I cut the internet off. When you get to the gold medal level of competition, the kid who spends an extra 90 minutes dicking around on YouTube loses, because they all have the same level of fitness. And again, it just loops back to what limiters have you put in place? Because in a perfect world situation, in a perfect situation with tip top, like fully, overcompensated, or whatever term that sports physiologists like to use, they will equal out almost every time. And so then it comes down to, well, you actually got a cold the 2 weeks before, or you got in a scuff with your girlfriend, or you stayed up late. And so these sorts of things I watched like a hawk, because I saw those as the things that affected performance most at the highest level. And because I looked at blood work every few weeks and I saw, like, if someone got an infection, I literally saw it move up the floors. Like, I saw really cool stuff happen, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, that sort of stuff I could see in real time. And so I could change how the cafeteria, the kitchen ended up serving food, because in different countries, they have different standards.
What were you tracking for blood work?
I got carte blanche. I could just get the works. So I looked for kids who maybe started supplementing things on their own, wink, wink, looking mostly at vitamin mineral deficiency type stuff, looking at immune and inflammation factors. So I'd rather avoid getting in the weeds there. I looked at generic sort of things then discuss it with the strength and conditioning coach and the wrestling coach to help modify their training, because in that sort of situation, you have limited personalized training and they all train as a team. And they really only give autonomy to the, like, if you win a gold medal, essentially you can train yourself. And so everyone else followed along with the programming. And so we consulted each other to change for fatigue management, essentially. And different nutrition practices in different countries created some interesting problems early on. For instance, like in the United States, I took for granted that we iodized the salt, and there, no. And so I started seeing like all these strange sort of things that hinted at, like iodine deficiency. And it went like, I salt the shit out of it, but they have different salt. And so as soon as we swapped the salt source, and pew, a lot of interesting, fun things started happening. And so that sort of stuff that just as an ignorant American moving to another country, I could see something like that, thankfully, because I had access to that stuff. And so that probably gives you the most exciting thing as far as like, what one change did you make that boosted performance immediately from a nutrition side? That iodine supplementation.
Simple as that.
Yeah, because when I got there, I saw like really just population-wide iodine deficiency. Just crazy, man. And they only ever drank distilled bottled water, because they actually rejected the municipal water supply. Also interesting. So I got them to swap to, for instance, because I got access to all sorts of interesting health records, I swapped them to fluoridated water. Also a big deal for long-term health with teeth and gum health that actually just ends up affecting performance in the long run. If you get a cavity or whatever, that takes you out. So really interesting things like that, that I guess people like me, whatever you, just a spoiled American would take for granted. That and mandating that we put climate control inside of the training area, because they still had this mental toughness sort of vibe, because they had some world champion coaches from the 60s and 70s there that like they would, if they had a heater, they would have cranked it up in the middle of the desert while they wrestled. And I fought tooth and nail to get climate control in there. And as soon as we got climate control in there, all of their heart rates just went right down and performance went up immediately. And so those sorts of interesting factors from a physiology standpoint occurred as well, that again, I just consider basic stuff, like the most basic stuff, beyond what any of us really talk about on a day-to-day basis, at least online. Like they want to improve performance with all sorts of means. And just looking at some of the basic data, like looks like climate control would work better than any drug you put in them right now. And it turns out that just team-wide performance went up when it got below frickin' 110F in the training facility.
Can you expand from a physiological point of view, how dropping the heart rate like that with climate control improved performance?
Well, in a nutshell, they would go tachycardic almost immediately, man. Like your heart rate goes up when you get hot anyway. And so their heart rate reserve, and they would have a smaller heart rate reserve. And sorry, my dimness is getting all weird. Just watching them, they would exhaust faster. They would take longer to recover. As far as the physiology there, I would leave that. I'd let you discuss it with a physiologist. As far as the molecular mechanism, I mean, I can look it up. I reserve that sort of stuff for, like, I can give you a graph if you want. I can tell you that it screws with your power output quite a bit. It also, because of the way that they built the building, when you have hundreds of bodies in the same room, the humidity also went up. So I opted for air conditioning as well, as a way to take fluid or moisture out of the building, because when you have high humidity, your evaporative cooling goes to crap. And so on more than one occasion, boys would actually get heat stroke in there, which, at the time they just attributed to mental weakness or whatever. And by lowering the temperature, it just kept them from getting heat stroke at the very least. And by using actual air conditioning rather than like swamp cooling, I could pull water out of the air. And so when they did sweat, sweating actually worked. And that also ended up probably helped with their electrolyte balance, etc. At least to some degree. I had them consuming so much salt that like I put a ton of it in their intra-workout beverages. So I feel comfortable enough with saying that when temperature gets too high, your performance goes to crap, and you put yourself at a health risk. And
makes sense.
Enough people had health issues that like that I threw a fit even in front of like fancy politicians for them, which another story for another time. But basically, they could. I did see increases in power output, and decreases in time to recovery between bouts when they did wrestling practice. And so because of that, they could actually get more volume in during their training. And so just by virtue of these sort of climate control changes, they could increase their training volume specifically for technique practice, which ended up making a pretty big difference in overall performance too.
That makes perfect sense. I just know, I'm not too sure, is Azerbaijan Soviet influenced from memory?
Until 91.
Yeah, so I'd imagine a lot of those training philosophies would have come from the Soviet system.
Yes, correct. And I guess Nietzsche said that God is dead, but the writing is on the wall still. That like they still have the major influences, as you said, still exist probably for the next, 20 or 30 years. And I can tell you that the kids there, the teenagers there now speak English instead of Russian. And so you'll probably see a full transition out of that in the next couple of generations, even though I know nothing about geopolitics, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, very wise. How did you get involved in Azerbaijan? Like, how did they find you?
Oh my goodness. I got an email on April 1st. So I thought I got an April Fool's joke from a strange looking email address that ended in .az. And it said, "Do you make wrestling?" Like that.
Like a scammer.
Yes. I said yes. I just said yes. And 30 minutes later, I got an e-ticket confirmation for Miami, Florida.
Wow.
Yeah. And I flew over there like straight up out of a novel. Terrifying experience. Perfect time of my life to do that, by the way. Terrifying experience. Went to Miami to the Regis St. Bartlett or Bartlett St. Regis. I forget the name, real fancy hotel, and went to the top of that and just saw like this crew of very scary people with cube-shaped heads that then did whatever they did their equivalent of interviewing me. That involved looking at, stacks of blood work this high in Russian, of course, and some in Turkish. Although, some of for the things that they pointed out, the cognates looked pretty obvious, and also the reference ranges. But basically, they said, "Okay, we make Azerbaijan now." Like they would literally freaking fly me off the top of a building in a helicopter, and no, I got to graduate first, man, because they found me right before I graduated with my doctoral degree, and they just wanted to steal me away then. Zero negotiating on pay or anything, just like real terrifying experience. And they said, "When do you graduate?" I said, "I forgot, May something." And then they said, "Okay, we leave Azerbaijan, graduation day +1." And so I did. And real terrifying experience. Glad I did it. Doubt I would ever do it again in the sort of circumstances that it occurred. Oh, that gives you the sort of Cliff's notes of how that worked. Believe it or not. I literally got an email. I thought I got a joke email. I said, "Sure, I make wrestling." And then I just said, "Screw it." I YOLO'd and went to Florida, and I got cryptic text messages from a phone number that had like freaking 14 digits. And I somehow made it to this hotel, and there they sat. That
does sound like a movie.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Real scary.
How do you think they found you?
Oh, I had a pretty active online presence.
Okay.
So what particular online presence, who knows, or someone they knew, maybe somebody that they knew referred me, who knows? So in a position like this, when you get recruited to have that sort of like move away from the United States and live in a foreign country to train Olympic athletes sort of situation.
Is it a recruitment or is it a kidnapping?
Well, excellent question. I'll leave you to decide. Willful, volitional, volitional napping. At least when I got there, I realized I had a very low chance of getting back under specific circumstances, a different conversation. In any case, it gets real tough, I would imagine, to recruit for a position like that for multiple reasons. One, you have to find what you would assume, you have to find what you would consider a competent person. And two, if you do find a competent person, they have to have the position of like, okay, I can move away for years at a time. And that sort of situation, finding a competent person that has the qualifications to do that sort of job would already have an established business. And so the opportunity cost of moving away actually exceeds any reasonable amount of pay that they could give, even from a primarily oil-funded country for sport, because they have they have a sports arm of their government that funds that funds their athletes for the Olympics. So they have pretty deep pockets for that sort of thing on a relative basis. And although my competence for team sports, like working with big populations at a time, I would have considered limited. I considered myself competent enough to work with any one person and then attempt to scale it, which got interesting when I got there and saw how many people. Really, you run into limitations of, can this person do it, or at least do most of it? And can we get them to leave the United States for a very long time? And that essentially leaves like me as a person that has like limited competence. Like I could do a lot of the stuff they wanted me to do from like a checkbox standpoint, but also I would move away. And I think that may have frankly turned into the constraint that they had, as far as like, they probably went down this list of just really high priority people. And then finally just like, they made their way to me, right? Because they probably went to, whoever they found as top-notch people that they looked up. And then when they got to me, I could actually leave. So if I give you an idea how that sort of recruiting process worked, I would make that my best guess.
Or they could have been going behind the scenes and actually have done a full background check on you before they even sent you that one email.
And they did. They absolutely did. They absolutely did. Although I object to feed myself the belief that they considered me their first choice. Other people exist and they probably just had businesses and it would have been difficult to move them. So although I will take what you say as a compliment, they definitely did their homework. They knew interesting things about me. And I would go. So I could do it, and I did do it. And we brought back, like, just for the men. No, actually, we brought back 18 medals and 1 gold. Very, very cool experience for that. Yeah. So you have a team dynamic you have to deal with, and to find people for those positions that have team experience and competence. They have businesses where they work with, they already have teams, which leaves you with fresh people like me, relatively speaking, or essentially retirees. And so, like, for instance, when I phased myself out, I saw that they started talking to Felipe of Cohen Felipe. Forgive me, I forget his first name, but like epic strength coach from a while ago. So people that have experience, that have, sorry, I got itchy. They have experience, a long time experience with the United States, and maybe have since retired from or moved away from having an established business, that then they could essentially retire there or live somewhere else in the meantime.
How did you ever retire from there and say, I want to leave? Was that an easy process?
No. Nope. I actually had a bunch of family issues at the time. Like, one of my family members actually got murdered.
Wow.
And yeah. And so when we came back to the United States for a wrestling event, a big wrestling event, I think the Wrestling World Championships, I've stayed here and forfeited a lot of pay and things that I left in that country, et cetera. And so that actually ended up turning into a breaking point that I had. I had a family member that got murdered. And soon after that, they had scheduled to go to the United States for a world championship of wrestling world championships. I forget the name exactly. And then I stayed here instead of going back.
And that sounds
explains.
It's crazy. It's an amazing story, actually. Everything of that.
Yeah, all sorts of interesting stuff in between.
What were some of your biggest takeaways from working in that environment that you now apply?
Oh, that I now apply. Good question. Well, actually, a lot of the stuff that we spoke about before, like before we started talking about me turning into the prisoner of Azkaban, my American friends called it Azkaban, because I did have an internet connection there at least, even though I lived in a cave for a good part of the time, actually did. Because of the communication mandates, I lived in a building with like 6 languages, man. And so I had to communicate things as simply as I possibly could, and have a focus on very fundamental things, so that when I did come back to the United States, it ended up sort of instilling three things, I suppose. One, to communicate in as simple terms as I can when giving directions to anybody. Because I realized that for the hyper competent person, the simple directions just saves them cognitive load.
Yeah.
It takes less energy. And for the person that really does have skill deficiencies or language deficiencies, it helps them understand it anyway. And so I realized that when giving directions, the simpler, the better. And working in a foreign country with half a dozen languages just in the one building alone really instilled that a lot. 2, just the tremendous focus on less than basic, like fundamental, like real fundamental stuff. like, do you have air conditioning sort of things? So like they would get chronic respiratory infections. I installed HEPA filters in the building. And like just overall health for like, just from a population standpoint, skyrocketed. Looking at like, because I had access to all sorts of fun things, I could see like how many fewer tissues, like Kleenex tissues, snot rags we bought.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. Like measurable, like they saved more money in hygiene products by installing HEPA filters, for instance, and had fewer, I would say sick days, but like sick days. They had fewer people complaining about what they would consider sick symptoms. So, nobody really took days off except for the scheduled days off, obviously, but just looking at the purchases of other products that I correlated to installing HEPA filters in the building, like they had a cost savings just from that, but also a health savings too, which then I'd make the assumption boosts performance in the long term, because you limit how often people get sick. You limit, they can breathe more, they
increase training load.
Yeah, they sleep better, presumably. So yes, I did. I correlated those factors together. What I say cause behind closed doors, I would say, yeah, it absolutely caused a lot of good stuff to happen. With open doors in front of a pedantic crowd, no, I would say that we had positive correlation when installing air filters in the building. But it did. And that just an extreme focus on basic stuff. And for the United States, here, when I work with people in the United States, I would consider basic stuff like do you know how to cook? Really, because a lot of people can turn up the fire on their barbecue all the way, or they can punch a bunch of numbers in the microwave, and that differs from like, can you make food you like to eat? Do you know how to store food properly? Can you manage a pantry? Those sorts of basic skills that we take for granted. A lot of people say they can do it, and they can do it good enough to survive. Although, can you do it good enough to feed yourself 100% of the time for an extended duration and like doing it? So I focus a lot on those sort of fundamental, like almost like life skills, man, of what it would take. Because if you present somebody with a plan of, exercise and nutrition, a lot of people, me included, were like, okay, you eat these things and you do these exercises. That means, can you get to the gym? It means, do you have the right footwear? It means, can you drive? It means, can you shop? Can you cook? Like all these skills all these underlying skills it takes to adhere to a plan. Most coaches, and for good reason, would just overlook and assume people can do it. And people struggle way more than you think, man. Just with basic human stuff. And instead of, putting someone on a crucifix for it, like I just start with that first. We make the joke that it's not the chicken's fault, man. Because for a vast majority of people who hate dieting or whatever sort of language they use, it really comes down to like, maybe if you could cook better and had foods that you like to eat, this process would really simplify itself. And when you try and survive by drinking cartons of egg whites and scarfing down microwave chicken breasts, like I can see why this would get frustrating for you. And those sorts of things, again, make a huge difference, especially when you get into a family environment, for instance, where now a person who has limited cooking skills and communication skills, for instance, now they've changed the way that they operated within the context of their family environment with a spouse and kids. And now you have relationship conflicts because now this person just sort of randomly started changing all of their behaviors. Who's this Dr. Kashey guy? Why are you flipping your life upside down? This guy's an idiot, right? And so now you have an opportunity rather than an obstruction to integrate the family into this person so this person can adhere to the plan. And then many times the whole family ends up joining as members or clients in some fashion, because now they can start exercising together. I get emotional about this too. They can start cooking together. They can start doing all of these things that can improve the quality of their lives, whether they get skinny or not. And for that reason, I put tons of focus into it, because if you know how to manage food, like actually manage physical food in a pantry and cook and measure and do it well, your life gets better anyway. And because your life gets better over here, it improves your efficacy in other areas too. Once you realize you can do this, if you follow any work from good old Bandura, he believes that when you get good at one thing, it helps you get good at other stuff too. People call it self-efficacy. And I have a different philosophy as far as how I explain that, although I do consider I see the phenomena every day.
Why do you think
behaviors transfer?
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. Why do you think it's so hard for people in the real world to stick to a plan? And like, why do the majority of us fall off the bandwagon? I think you kind of answered it before. Maybe the reason why you do so well is... Oh, sorry, you carry on.
Yeah, I'll give you two and I'll see if it correlates with your guess. I take behavioral approaches to things, and then I'll take the sort of psychological, cognitive, whatever. I call it verbal behavior now. So I like the thinking cognition side of things, where a lot of people have perfectionistic standards. I should, must, have to do all of these things perfect, or else. Actually, shoot, I'll convenient. Give me a second here. Let's see here. Boop. Actually, I had this pulled up because I just gave a talk on something similar. That we harbor these demands, man. So I have distortions here generally, we'll talk about in a second. We have these demands of ourselves. We have these demands of other people, and we have these demands of the situation in general. I must be perfect. You must treat me perfectly, and I have to get the results I want, or else. So if you have that sort of instructions that you give yourself, man, that I must follow the plan exactly, which a lot of people do. They say, I must do this. I should be perfect. I have to give Dr. Kashey the best data ever. I know that you work with people that want to give you impeccable data and want to do things for you that you tell them. And they put that pressure on themselves to perform. And they start masturbating. I must do this perfect. Okay.
Love that.
And that sort of stuff from a language pattern standpoint correlates. Go away, Siri. Okay. Oh, wow. Excuse me. Wowza, exactly. I call that demandingness. I should, must, have to, need, gotta. Do you be perfect, essentially? Do you really have to do these things? Must you do them? No, it does make your life easier if you do. How do I do this?
I'm here to help.
I bet you are, Siri. There, sorry. Good grief. So this demandingness, I consider the should, must, have to, need sort of dichotomous language pattern, where if you can add or else to something that you say, you set yourself up for an emotional disturbance over here. So if I should act perfect, I must adhere to this plan. Well, then now you have a high chance of disturbing yourself, probably in the form of anxiety. And you know, as a coach, about performance anxiety, for instance. And so you can use this as a very simple model to look for where it might come from. Maybe you put pressure on people that they have to perform perfect or else. Then they start getting anxious. They spy on themselves and fail. A self-fulfilling prophecy, some people would say. And so when you start putting these perfectionistic demands on yourself, I must follow this plan perfectly or else, and then you inevitably screw up, because humans do that. Can you do anything perfect? No, only a person with godlike powers can do that. And so when you screw up, you start dramatizing. I never get anything right. This sucks. I always fail. Everything stinks. It's horrible, terrible, awful. You get to the most extreme side. Like, man, that tidal wave that wiped out a whole island, I would consider awful, terrible, horrible. You ate like an extra chicken breast or something, and now you call yourself awful because of it. Like, do those things even track? No, although we use those language patterns, and because we have the sort of respondent behaviors associated with horrible, terrible, awful, of entire villages getting wiped out by natural disasters, and we use that word to talk about the way we eat, you get a similar sort of emotional response through respondent conditioning. And so now everything is horrible, terrible, awful. I fail. Then from there, when you dramatize, you start to down yourself. I'm an idiot. I'm a failure. Or you can down other people, or you can down the situation. My coach is an idiot. So for the sake of our conversation, we'll say, I'm no good. I'm an idiot. I suck. I'll fail. And after you do that, you go, I must be perfect, or else what? Or else I'll fail every time, nothing ever works, because I'm a freaking idiot. When you get to that point, you start despairing. Why bother? And so this can happen in any order, by the way. I just see this happening the most common, this pattern. You start demanding, then you start dramatizing, exploding things out of proportion, big or small. Then you start insulting and labeling yourself and other people. And then you start giving up. Why bother? I can't stand it anymore. And I steal from Albert Ellis that people get the I can't stand it-itis, where you set these perfectionistic demands, you work your way down these language patterns. When you inevitably screw up a few times, and you go, F it, why bother anymore? You get to the despairing. So from a language pattern, like semantic priming of behavior standpoint, I consider that a very big contributor, that people put perfectionistic demands on themselves, and then they travel down that language pattern tree until they give themselves permission to give up, either on purpose or by accident. So hopefully that tracks a little bit.
Do you think the psychology around perfectionism gives people an out because they know that they're going to muck up eventually?
That asks a very good question, one that the behavior side, I think, can address, because that brings in intentionality and subconscious stuff that, like, I actually consider an out for people who try to describe it.
Okay.
So really, people use subconscious or willpower or whatever to say, I don't know shit. So I'll just put subconscious in here to have it make sense. Do they have situations in the past where they have failed? Yes. And when they failed, did it suck? Yes. And when that happens, sucky things get stored into your memory. And so then when you approach a similar situation, those stimuli generalize. You now recognize a situation where you failed before, and it primes that sort of emotional response. I like to give this example, Mr. Zimmerman. If I hold a head of broccoli up and I punch you in the face a bunch of times, do you know what happens? You hate broccoli. You go into the store, you see a head of broccoli, your heart rate will shoot right up. And so do you avoid going to the store as an out? So that sort of language, I think, contributes to maybe the underlying frame that clients act lazy or clients act resistant to directions, which, true or not, it actually makes the coach's job more difficult when they frame the client that way. And so from a standpoint of what can I do to help this person, man, we can address the environmental and the historical contributors to these sort of things so that we can either avoid them, work around them, or work through them. Because saying that a person does this so they can quit at any time really just writes you a permission slip to quit, ironically enough, in my opinion.
Yeah,
you can
so
say,
true.
well, it looks like they gave up because they meant to, they took it out. And so in a tragic sort of ironic twist, you actually pull that card on yourself, the royal you, of course. So taking intentionality and throwing it in the garbage, because if you treat it as like, well, they just do whatever they want, well, then why would you bother coaching at all? You could just give them a PDF and tell them to go away. And so you end up shooting yourself in the foot as far as the sort of job you have as a practitioner, man, in my opinion, of course. So that covers the behavior side a little bit, that I consider this problem with adhering to any sort of plan. At first, it comes from, well, you have a punishing experience, and then you avoid punishing experiences because learning stuff, because animals I make the joke that from pigeons to people, they learn to avoid things that suck. Now, we have innate things that suck, like fire, getting burned. We also have acquired things that suck, like getting made fun of. And so it still follows the same, like you still learn this stuff the same way. It's just some earlier on in life, those situations got paired. If you hurt yourself and someone points at you and says, ha ha, then those two situations get paired. And then when someone points at you and says, ha ha, you get crappy feelings. And that just, learning happens that way. So now when you go into these other situations where you want to adhere to a plan, especially when you've tried to do this so many times before, you have literally taught yourself to fail sometimes on accident. You have these crappy experiences and then you avoid them. And when you avoid those crappy experiences, you reinforce your avoiding. And so by correlating that sort of avoidance behavior with these language patterns, when you interact with people, you can start forming some connections as far as like, what can we look at to raise the probability that you adhere? Because by the way you explain this situation to me, we can then start identifying and disputing these really distorted thought patterns that you have, framing them into something more useful, and maybe modifying your plan to increase the probability that you'll adhere. So if you got punched in the face by me a bunch of times with a head of broccoli, maybe that means you get cauliflower instead for a while. As a way to generalize broccoli later. So that sort of stuff you can, if you care to put that much time and energy into it. If you really want to see why people deviate from plans, in my opinion, you take the more semantic orientation. How do people explain the situation, and how does that language prime their behavior? And I take a semantic orientation in particular because since most people work remotely or even in an office, how much control do you have over that person's life outside the office? Zero. And so lots of the other stuff you could kind of throw in the garbage. You get limited. You have a logistical and practical limitation of talking. And so I defaulted to a semantic orientation because I got limited to a semantic orientation. What do they say? How do they report it? And that then ended up taking me from the psychology side all the way over to behavior and seeing how verbal behavior ended up interacting with fundamental learning, like operant conditioning type stuff. And you can see, or at least I hope I explained it in an okay enough way to see how those sorts of things interact with each other. That if you ring the bell and the dog salivates, well, you can also say dinner time while you ring the bell, and you can say dinner and the dog salivates. Now, does actual language work like that? No. I just like to give that sort of example that you can correlate noises to all sorts of interesting behaviors. And with humans, we just call those noises words.
No, I totally get that.
Looking at it from that perspective has really, on a fundamental level, changed the way how I operated with other people.
And it's brilliant, like in terms of it's attacking the issues that are ultimately going to come up and being able to kind of build upon those so that they can, I guess, not drive future outcomes. Yes.
And so I encourage, and I say me a lot so that I can take blame if somebody takes issue with it, frankly. that I encourage a positive present tense and action-oriented dialect. I call it PPA. A lot of people say, I can't do this, I can't do that. Well, what can you do? So looking at a person's language, people like to use a lot of negative words because negative words economize. They make it simpler to speak. And
why do you think that is?
Well, I'll just actually lump it up to an economizing of language, like just resources. By adding or ant, like N apostrophe T or like in front of or behind words, you cut your vocabulary down. Like if you take negative modifiers, if you take a negative modifier and add it to a word, you double your vocabulary. And so just by an economizing of language, you raise the efficiency in which you can put noise out of your mouth, although you make it more difficult to take that noise and make use of it. Because if I say, Mr. Zimmerman, you're not dumb, the dominant part of that sentence equals dumb. And so you hear dumb and go, what dumb? And you say, oh, not. And so you go through all of these steps to actually translate that sentence. Now, when you have your head on straight, so to speak, and you have a cool demeanor, that happens pretty fast. You still translate, like you notice I say the word dumb, then you see the word not, and then you do the translation. Now, if you work with a stressed out person or a person that has limited verbal repertoire, when you use those sorts of language patterns, it puts a lot of load on that other person to understand what you say. And when people give themselves directions that way, like, don't think about a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, what do? Right? You end up creating these sort of ironic processes, and you start doing the very things you want to avoid because you say, I can't miss this rep, I can't miss this rep, I can't miss this rep. The primary part of the sentence, miss this rep. And looking at that those sorts of language patterns that end up priming behaviors that cause sabotage or deviating from the plan or whatever, you can actually have a person give themselves more efficient directions. Because when you behave, you talk to yourself. We call it thinking. In reality, we talk to ourselves. And when we talk to ourselves, we give ourselves directions to do things. And if you give yourself dumbass directions, you do dumbass things, man. And I say that with a heavy heart rather than as a joke.
Yeah, it's innate in us to always focus on the negative, isn't it, in most of our life?
I would say a majority of the time, yes. And that makes a lot of sense because the people that ignored bad stuff got eaten for lunch, literally.
Yep. It's our safety mechanism.
Correct. And so it makes perfect sense to operate that way. And because we live so long and we have such good hardware, we just end up accumulating really sophisticated ways of avoiding all this stuff that have networked with bad. And by changing the way you speak, you change the way you give yourself directions, and you at least you give yourself a chance to operate differently. If you have a new verbal stimulus, then you open up the probability for a different observable response.
I love that. Change the way you
don't miss the rep, don't miss the rep, don't miss the rep, to breathe. You might have a better chance of doing the rep well. For instance, now different cues for different people. I just like to look at the language patterns in general and see the things that you obsess over and recur as problems. For a lot of people, when they talk about it to themselves and they talk about it out loud, they have them in a very negative frame. As something, I hate this, I don't want to be fat anymore. For instance, I don't want to be fat. Now the primary part of that sentence, to be fat. And so they obsess over fatness all day. And what sort of behavior does that prime? Different behavior than might help them. And that sort of stuff has made, when transferred well, really changes how people operate on a fundamental level, because on a fundamental level, at least what people would call consciously, you tell yourself what to do. And so if you talk to yourself in a different way, you do different stuff. in short. And it ends up helping a lot with how people communicate with their children. For instance, stay out of the street. Well, what the fuck does that mean? And so do small children really have the capacity to translate to translate it that fast? Because stay out of the street has street as the subject of the sentence. when you could say, hold my hand. And when you give somebody directions and you say, be careful, what the hell does that mean? Does a person really know what that means? People really just hear be careful after they get screwed up, then they get punished, and then you say be careful next time. Does anyone ever actually teach you how to be careful, man? No. And so when we hear be careful, it really raises our anxiety levels because it just happened as part of a punishment when we screwed up before. Be careful next time. Well, what does that mean? So if you want someone to be careful, whatever that means, it would help to show them careful means this, do these things. Can you show me? Great, now we know. So does that give you an idea of like simplifying directions?
Oh, the way you just described then talking to kids, like I've got two toddlers, a 4 and a 3-year-old. So using that logic is exactly what I do.
Yes, I love kids so much, man. I love kids so much. And speaking with them, I find it an interesting and amazing challenge because it puts this dialect to the test. Because in my opinion, when it all gets worked out, it turns into maybe if you bring it down to the grade level too, it provides the simplest grammar for giving and receiving directions. If you have a person in a dangerous situation, like if you have a suicidal person hopped up on drugs doing silly stuff, do you say, don't shoot yourself? Like how much extra load does it take to do that instead of saying drop it? And so those sorts of differences, how much translating does it take to perform the direction? Much less. Really, what does don't shoot the gun mean? It can mean a lot of different things. It means literally anything other than shooting the gun from a conceptual standpoint.
Limit the translation. Love it. So
yes.
Simple.
Yes. Difficult.
Yes.
And you could, maybe you've seen that I take awkward pauses sometimes when I speak to you because I still actively translate after well over a year, actually close to 2 years of dedicated practice. I speak almost exclusively in this dialect. And so I take strange pauses because I catch myself before I say something negative.
That's good. It's a skill set we all should learn.
I at least I take the position that it simplifies communication from somebody teaching to somebody learning. I would rather, if since we have jobs of giving directions, it behooves us to make the directions as accessible as possible, period. Otherwise, we put it on them to figure it out for themselves. And then coaching turns into a negative selection process rather than a development process. You just end up seeing who can figure it out for themselves rather than actually helping somebody get better. And it turns out that enough people can figure it out for themselves that you actually think you did a good job.
Yeah, it's definitely a skill set I've been working on in the last few years in terms of reducing my sentence structure to get the same message across, because verbal diarrhea is so easy to be seen through.
Yes. And in situations like this, where I like to think out loud, it looks like I deviate heavily from what I preach, and I do from a rule standpoint. Although I very much appreciate these sort of BSing sessions because we can think through these sorts of concepts and refine them. And I prefer when I speak to other talented experts that have education in this area to get out the best bad ideas I can. Yeah.
Smart discourse, that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah. We all want the same thing, man. We all want the same thing.
So what are some of the biggest misconceptions in, I guess, diet, weight loss, training that absolutely do your head in?
That do me what?
That does your head in, that you just can't stand? Like calories in, calories out. Keto.
I more take issue with putting diet ideologies on children. I can manage anything with adults, and I say I dramatize anything, dramatizing on purpose. That again, when you look at it in the context of what does this person know, what experiences do they have, getting irritated because somebody says something about nutrition or diet, like they say what they know and they know what they got taught. And so me really having a prejudice against that, I have gotten over at least. And as far as other experts that argue over those pedantic things, I more or less just shut it out. Because does that help the person that you work with walk around the block and cook three square meals a day? No. So if I want to go into the nuanced technical science, I go to the books and the papers. And when I work with clients, I work with clients on human and behavioral stuff. And I keep those things relatively separate unless we have an opportunity to have them interact with each other. I very much separate trying to apply papers that got published within the last couple of years to a population that would benefit from walking around the block and eating more vegetables. I just find it asinine to try and force that sort of translation at all. So anything that really bugs me, it bugs me when somebody disturbs themselves over a diet ideology they have, rather than any specific diet ideology or misconception. I think you said misconception. So a lot of people will work themselves up and they'll get emotional problems over beliefs they have around food, nutrition, and exercise. And so I have what some people call like an empathic response because of that. I hate that this person feels so bad over something that over an erroneous conception. Okay. So I get worked up when people that I care about get worked up over silly stuff, to answer that question. What other part to your question did you have?
No, that's essentially asked it. And I've got a follow-up to that. So you've mentioned kids a few times.
Oh, yeah.
How do you address the kid side of things? Do you always deal with the environment and the family first, because essentially they're driving what's happening, or do you solely work on the?
Really good question. It gets interesting. I limit my work with children to in person for that reason, because depending on the age, actually at all ages, you end up working with the parents. So do I have an effect? Do I have an influence over the environment? Only like maybe 2 to 3 degrees of separation of that. It really, kids do what they get taught to do. Adults do what they get taught to do, really, but kids do what they get taught to do. So if a parent sees maybe something that they consider a problem with their child, it turns into coaching the parent, essentially, to look in the mirror. And working directly with children, especially to have, sometimes medical issues or whatever, it just changed my life when a little kid, 6 or 7, ran into my office and gave me a hug. He said, "Dr. Kashey, my tummy doesn't hurt anymore." And just floored me, man. Floored me. And at that point, fuck how many grams of chicken, the optimal mTOR expression, shut up. What do you really accomplish? That sort of stuff, it just really leveled me. That, and living in Azerbaijan for a while and just seeing the standard of living there, what they consider problems versus what we consider problems, working with children, just bad at a kid that has he lost all of his intestines and he still lives and does kid stuff, And so those things, it really just leveled me as far as, where do I want to put my priorities here? If I want to look at the molecular biology and biochemistry of nutrition, I can do that for fun over here. Will I attempt to transplant that onto soccer mom Susie? No. Or even to world champion Azerbaijani athlete? No. At what point does that sort of translation help in real time? If anything, it provides a bit of novelty that has a skeptical person or a zealot-like person to adhere to something for the short term. Although, for another conversation, people like novelty. But has anything really changed in nutrition in the last 20 years? Has anything really changed other than Kevin Hall validating the calorie? In the last 2 decades. So at that point, I realized that if somebody figured out some amazing new way to count calories, we would all know pretty fast. And until then, there's just the fundamental biology applies in all cases. And people at all levels, in my experience, have benefited from a more violent execution of the fundamentals in varying contexts. So I deviated from your question a little bit to loop back to the kid part. I also had a couple of instances where kids have had surgery because of essentially vegan ideologies put on children. rickets and just like first class individuals in a first world country that has with a child that has vitamin deficiencies because of nutrition ideologies translated in an amateurish way. And that really just ground my gears. When you see a kid that has like surgery on their bones because they had oat water instead of a reasonable calcium source, for instance, like that really got me going pretty good. And especially working with physique athletes that have children, where I worked in person, I had a pediatrician that I worked with, very close friend, and with the parents' permission, I actually got to look at some interesting data that on average, I saw that whenever a parent prepared themselves for a physique competition, like get on stage for bodybuilding or fitness or bikini, it disturbed the growth charts of the children. And for quite a few people, when they started dieting down, their child started getting fatter. And the growth chart would spike. I correlated it exactly on more than one occasion, just real emotional experience, that whenever this woman dieted for a competition, and I say woman, I really mean like a group, the child's BMI skyrocketed, and it had a punctuated equilibrium as far as the BMI. So the child would grow normally, and then the mom would diet, the weight would skyrocket, she'd compete, and then the BMI would stabilize, she would compete, and the BMI looked like this. And any reason, maybe she ended up cooking all of her favorite food for her family while she drank egg whites in the corner, frustrated, right? Who knows exactly what happened? I just saw those sorts of situations to see that how the hyper competitive nature in these amateur sports in particular end up affecting family lives and just quality of life in general. And I remember succinctly like correlating her weight because she kept her data, very fastidious with her data collection, of course, preparing for contests. And I showed her weight versus her child's weight changing, and it just seeing them go like this. And just the look on her face when she realized that sort of effect that it had on the rest of her family, it ends up changing a lot of decisions that people make. So like we spoke about before, what goal do you really want? Do you, and at TKN, we talk about, do you want to go towards good stuff, or do you want to go away from bad stuff? And so many people, like you said, have this sort of biological, I guess, default that we want to go away from bad stuff as our first priority. And away from bad stuff means avoiding. And we know that when you chronically avoid things, you end up causing more problems than you solve. And so we try and change the orientation from away from bad stuff to towards good stuff instead. That sort of gives you hopefully I answered your question directly or by tangent.
No, that was an amazing example. Thanks for that.
Okay.
In terms of dieting, are you a fan of that, or because that's essentially some avoidance, isn't it?
Well, that depends. So do I believe in using nutrition to lose fat? Absolutely. Absolutely. I could just answer your question that way. Now, when I say the word diet, I really mean like eat these foods in this order at these times. I tend to object to those sorts of things like keto or vegan or carnivore or whatever people do.
Liver King.
Aside from whatever proposed physiological benefit exists or not, from a behavior standpoint, that sort of restriction, especially on a person that has had a diet that has wide variety of things before, or they have issues with some of the foods, I more care that a person stays as close to their previous behavior as possible and start paying more attention to what they already do. And that alone does enough, from observer effects or the Hawthorne effect, to start people progressing. So basically, I will tell people, at least in the beginning, do what you already did. Just report it to me. And just by virtue of people paying attention to what they do, writing it down and sending it to me, their fat will already come off because they'll start correcting their own behavior or changing it more specifically, just by virtue of them watching themselves and reporting it to me. And by and large, health benefits, et cetera, from changing nutrition come from changing body weight and all of the other anthropometric and physiological changes that come with weight going down. And so just by virtue of a person losing maybe 10% or 15% of their body weight, they already reap a vast majority of the metabolic benefits that these other diets sort of advertise a person will get. And at that point, you can now make other assessments of, well, do you want to do something competitive? Do you have other things in your life you want to manage? And you can get as specific as you want. And that really just, the client takes the wheel, and sometimes I push back. And I tell you one thing for sure, that I like measuring things, because as a scientist, I feel like measuring things helps you make decisions. And I also take the position that you measure things whether you like to or want to or not. You measure with the clothes you put on. You measure when you look in the mirror. You measure when you eat too much and hate yourself. You measure when you use cups. You measure when you use a plate. So you measure no matter what. In every circumstance you measure. And for that reason, I give the opinion that if you measure, and you do, you may as well use something accurate and useful. Because otherwise you measure with something else, like how much you hate yourself, or how your clothes fit, or the mirror, or something that has so many degrees of separation from your current behavior, it makes it difficult to change a plan. And so we settle there initially that you measure whether you want to measure or not. And so since you do measure, we may as well use an accurate method, an accurate and reliable method, so that we can give more straightforward directions. In that regard, do I believe in specific diets for a vast majority of people? No, I care that you eat the things you like to eat, that you get your vitamin and mineral requirements, and that you eat enough. And I use enough to describe in the context of whatever goal you have at the time.
Always in context, enough.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Context, the most important thing. And some people have diets that have limitations or restrictions because of medical conditions, and fine. And they understand that, separate from the basic sort of recommendations that I would give, which amounts to, what do you currently eat? Does it get you the vitamins and minerals it takes to keep chugging along? And then we can just vary those amounts and vary the distribution of them. So people already eat protein, carbohydrate, and fat sources. They already have those foods. And so I would rather a person ate what they normally ate and cooked well, at least in the beginning. And then when they start making some progress, build some self-efficacy, then we can start experimenting with new things. So I'd rather the person just has the base of useful adult skills that they can take with them forever, and start with that. And then if they want to get fancy, great. Starting with the fancy stuff does work faster, and people crash harder, because you get into this sort of restriction disinhibition patterning that people love to talk about, where you restrict yourself a lot, and then you screw up. Then you go through and disturb yourself. Right? I have to eat this very specific diet perfect or else, and then you screw up, and then you fail. This will never work. I suck. I'm an idiot. My coach sucks. Why bother? I'll go to the bar. So that language pattern ends up kicking in, and then you spiral, because when you go off and you deviate with really tasty food, for instance, you get lots of positive reinforcement from eating all that amazing food. And so it ends up spiraling out of control because the punishment comes at a delay. So in other words, to use a more behavioral sort of explanation, very few people would drink if you got the hangover first. And so trying to use a psychological babbling explanation of that sort of thing, I consider a waste of time. In reality, the positive reinforcement comes at an instant, and the punishment comes at a delay. And that separation causes what looks like a conflict of values and behaviors, a lazy person, or whatever we would call it. That the reward for screwing up comes immediately, and the punishment comes at a delay. And that alone, I think, does enough to describe it in a vast majority of situations. People would stop, fewer people would drink if they got the hangover first.
So true, isn't it?
Well, at least I take that position. People still would. People still would. I just think fewer would. You can learn to do anything.
and your body will adapt to it too.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So how do you coach people on trying to create a new habit, behavior, or action?
I use principles of shaping and successive approximation, a fancy word for baby steps. But really, does anybody really teach new habits? I will argue, that gets a little technical as far as how you define habit. You tell me what habit means.
Well, it's very closely tied to a behavior, isn't it? I find it very hard to distinguish between a habit or a behavior.
Well, good. So I consider a behavior anything that you can measure in the body, pretty much. So, and either that you can observe, rather, I say observe, that I consider you, when you think, you talk to yourself, I consider that behaving, but only you can observe it.
Yep.
So to me, the habit has gotten really just really perverted into the next dimension of, like, people call going to the gym a habit. And I just find that absurd, because do you know how many steps it takes to go to the gym? Even getting out of a chair, putting on your shoes, like you could break that down into a million different behaviors before you even get to the gym. And so saying going to the gym is a habit, I just consider one of the most absurd things from, like, an analytics standpoint ever, because that takes this entire process of however many different actual steps and lumps it into just one thing, which I consider ridiculous. So again, to loop back from do I teach people new behaviors? I would argue very few people teach new behaviors. You more just arrange current behaviors in a different order.
That's brilliant. I love that.
Okay. Yeah, I try, like, I cringe, like I hid a little bit, you know.
That's awesome. Yeah, because so many people say in my work, they always talk about habit changing or changing of behaviors to head towards a goal. But that answer you've just done then is unbelievable. Like, it's all about changing current behaviors in a different order, because then that's more long lasting as well, isn't it?
Yes. People already do the things it takes to get what they want. It just, in a matter of speaking, you do them in a different order, and you do some things more and some things less. Very few people actually have to shape brand new behaviors, unless you, like, learn a new sport, in which case you do. Okay. If someone says, I want to do Olympic weightlifting, and they have only ever walked around the block, well, then you learn new behaviors, right? Does that mean, like, you create new habits or whatever? No. Okay. And so the discussion around habit, I kind of see as, like, when people throw the word subconscious around, they just use it as a filler word for something they know very little about.
It's all the rage at the moment, isn't it? Subconscious.
Yeah.
Ego.
And I use it as, like, a matter of fact thing rather than a pejorative thing. Like, do I insult them? Absolutely not. Like, it still furthers the conversation and helps people. It just confuses sometimes from an intervention standpoint and communication between professionals, because maybe both of them have a different definition of habit. And so I take issue with it from that context. From a day-to-day conversational standpoint, I think it serves the purpose just fine. From professional to professional, designing programs and interventions, using words like that I consider problematic, because you just, like, I think I'll throw you under the bus. You said hey, habit and behavior mean the same thing. Well, yeah, maybe so. And to me, what I call behavior, what you call behavior, differ. And so now, if we both talk about habits and agree, maybe we go off into two very different directions. And so from a coaching the coach, like we coach each other, I put coming to terms as probably the single most important thing to do first. And with clients, I use these words. I make these noises from my face. They mean these things. And very few people have that sort of conversation when they do anything. It's just when they use a common word, it may so I differentiate vocabulary and terminology. Vocabulary consists of the list of face noises you can make. And terminology consists of the application of those face noises in context. Like you can drop a C word in a lot of different contexts, and it means different things. right? And for that reason, you have one word that means it has a bunch of different terms. So when we use these words, especially in coaching or health or whatever, even those words, when we find ambiguous words, I try to make an attempt to come to terms on that word so that when we use it, we use it in the same way and achieve the same end with it. So if someone says establish new habit, I tend to take an annoying sort of Socratic approach of what the hell does habit mean? And if you mean actually this list, this chain of behaviors that takes 4 hours to complete, okay, that helps me. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It's awesome.
Okay. Because I get weird about that, although we all have our weird things. I just care about words a lot because I see firsthand, or rather connect firsthand, the sort of effect they have on behaving. And if we want to help somebody and we have a conversation about it, I take very seriously what those words mean so we can actually do it. We can actually do it instead of just agree.
Yeah, words are one of the major things that's interpreted from the other party, isn't it? So the language has to be on point.
What else do I have? At least some strength and conditioning coaches, they can watch someone and do physical manipulation, right? And even in that case, a vast majority of the directives come in the form of verbal stimuli, even of grunting, right? So even in different countries and different weight rooms, different grunts mean different things. And knowing those things ahead of time really helps expedite the change process. As silly as that sounds,
So final question, and it's probably going to be going on a tangent for you. I know you talk about this a lot on your social media. What advice do you give people who are wanting to live a life full of meaning and purpose?
Oh my goodness. What an emotional question.
Because I feel like, especially what's happened in the last few years, a lot of people are searching for that.
Get good at something. Anything. Get good at something. And if you get good at something, anything, that will open so many doors. It will open so many doors for you because you have something that you can do. You have something that you can do well. You can provide value with it. You can receive value back, which opens more doors for you again, which means you can learn more skills. And from just a practical application standpoint, just get a skill and get very good at it and use that skill to take on more responsibility. And when you can provide value to somebody else that can provide value back, you've now established a functional relationship with that person that opens more doors for you than before. So take all this nihilistic meaning of life, throw it in the garbage, get good at something, anything that you can use to provide value for another person, and reciprocity will end up taking care of itself soon enough. If you get good at something, if you master some skill, somebody will find that skill useful and they will do whatever they can to help you. And some people will screw you. We've all had those sorts of situations. And so it really does turn into a game where you help as many people as you can with the skill that you've mastered, and you will find one that makes up for all the other people that have either given you equal value back, which great, or people that have ended up taking advantage of you. So when it comes to meaning and purpose, I consider that more of an idiosyncratic thing, like an individual conversation, although trying to establish something, getting a skill and mastering that skill gives you so many opportunities to really have a life worth living. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, that's brilliant. I'd probably expand on that. And I like to think about being of service and significance to others.
Sure. So I take an equal opposite of, I consider this super selfish. And instead of really demonizing selfishness, just understand that if you derive value or satisfaction from helping another person, capitalize on that. It means that you do get we all get positive reinforcement from attention, affection, and approval from the right people. And instead of trying to hide away from that, embrace it. Find out the sort of person you do want to help, that you do want to give you attention, affection, and approval, and provide them value with that skill. Because how do mentorships work? You know, if somebody works with you, they care if you approve of them. Did I do this right? How can I do better? If you give them a slap on the shoulder, say, "Attaboy," that feels good. They know they did the right thing. And when you teach somebody stuff, that helps them learn. People think the learning goes from like going through the reps. The learning really happens when you say, "Good, good, change this, good, good, good." The learning happens there, man. The learning happens at the consequence. The learning happens at the outcome.
That's cool.
And as an instructor, as an authority, as a person that works with other people, you can drive those outcomes for other people. And so when somebody does something good and you tell them "good job," especially right after they did it, learning happens then. You influence the differential reinforcement, the successive approximation of the behavior. You get the person from barely walking to doing triple backflips because of good, 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 change this, good, good, good. Every time they get a learning point, if you want to think about it like that. So in that vein, when you do find a skill that you want to get good at, finding somebody else who does it well really expedites that process, because in the beginning, it will suck because you suck. You'll have these perfectionistic demands of yourself. I must do well. I have to do this perfect. And working with another person that has an understanding of the skill you want to develop can help you approximate the ideal behavior. In other words, they can help you break it down into steps and tell you when you did a good job. Because in the grand scheme, you suck. Although in the scheme that they set you up with, from here to here, you did a fabulous job. And a person that knows how to do the skill well can do that for you. They can give you that positive reinforcement in the beginning to help carry you to the point where you have enough skill that it feels good just to do it on its own, which some people would call intrinsic motivation. And I just call that skill mastery. If you get good enough at something, it feels good to do it just to do it, because you get reinforcement back from the environment. If you try and learn the piano, you make all sorts of cacophonous noises, and the piano teacher starts you out in this specific sort of arrangement of keys. You make these noises, very simple. And when you do that, you get an attaboy, attagirl, gold star. Did you do anything that resembled something nice? No. Although the teacher, because they have a very extensive discriminative repertoire, they know piano well, they know that when you approximate it a little bit better than before, and they can mark that. And then eventually you get good enough at piano that just sitting down and playing the piano feels good. And that happens because you make nice noises. So hopefully that makes sense as far as like the successive approximation of skill acquisition and the value of having somebody there with you that knows how to do it well too, because that person carries you from that crappy phase where you suck, because they can tell you when you did good for a beginner. And that really makes such a massive difference in sticking to something in the long term. If you work with someone that takes you through that initial I suck phase, where you can get good enough at doing it that you can start coaching yourself. And then you can start deriving value and meaning and satisfaction out of doing this skill on your own when you get over that novice hump of sucking every time, because that other person will carry you. Hopefully that makes sense too.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you for that.
Finally,
it's what I kind of love doing these conversations for, how they expand. How can people find you, and how can people work with you?
I stay most active right now on the Instagrams at Dr. Kashey. And you can go to website, trevorkasheynutrition.com. I have a Facebook group, the best nutrition group ever. I stay pretty active on Instagram these days. I started there in earnest a few weeks back, and I post, maybe you've seen some of this stuff. I post a lot of videos on just general life skills with very high transfer on purpose. You know, anybody, gold medal athlete to child, like just focus on real beneficial stuff, maybe looking at it at a slightly different way than you normally would, and applying just basic daily principles to improve the quality of your life, to just make you better at whatever the heck you want to do. So at Dr. Kashey, you can find me there. And I do, at least at this point, still respond to every DM I get when I get them, because I right now I get feedback on my content, etc. So if you see any of the content and want to shoot me, that sucks, or you did well, I'll take both. I get differential reinforcement from it too.
And in terms of people wanting to work with you, you have like a membership program, or it's one-on-one? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have a Kickstart program that the vast majority of people go through first, have a 12-week program that we have a whole team of people work through, that goes through a lot of behavior change related stuff, where you track, or rather you assess your environment, assess the people in it, look at the way you make decisions, and correlate that with how you behave around food and eating. So the Kickstart program has a nutrition focus insofar as we use food as the fulcrum to help manage all of the other behaviors so that you can succeed with food and nutrition and activity and sport in the long term. But we call that the Kickstart program. And then when you go through the Kickstart program, you then can get assigned one-on-one with a coach, and all the skills you learn from the Kickstart program by far give you extra value as a one-on-one client. Because even though you get one-on-one attention in the Kickstart program with, like, you actually have a team running the Kickstart program, I have found, and I bet a lot of other coaches have found too, that when you take a person on from ground zero, especially, it takes a couple of months just to get bearings. And that causes a lot of extra work for the coach, a lot of frustration for the client. It costs them quite a bit of money because of that lag time of, like, okay, you can finally start getting real value out of the coaching after the first couple of months. And the Kickstart program just really blows that whole process out of the water. You get tremendous value out of it. You get a ton of attention. You learn a ton of great stuff. And then when you go into private client coaching, you can take all of that stuff, flop it right over, and hit the ground running. So you get a ton of results early because of how we deliver the program. And then when you do decide to work with a coach one-on-one, you can take all of those skills, translate them immediately, and hit the ground running with a coach. So that just lots of value on both sides. The coaches can do more coachy stuff, and you can get as much value out of it as humanly possible from day one.
It's quite refreshing hearing your approach and seeing the way you do things, because it's so easy to get caught up in the social media Fitstagrammers and be kind of caught up in the false way of doing things. And I think your approach and your understanding of psychology is an approach that we all need to master, because I think it's the right way of doing things. So well done on that.
Thank you so much. Just the most basic understanding of how learning works goes a real long way. I think psychology as a term has really just taken a turn in the last 50 years or so, when initially it just a bunch of dorks sat around to figure out how organisms learned things. And if you just have a basic understanding of learning, it will really change the way that you approach interacting with humans, dogs, and just anything alive. It really changes the way that you look at the world. Kind of like if you've seen The Matrix, like you see the code, when you have a fundamental understanding of how learning works versus like psychology and trying to assign personality disorders and traits and all this other crap, just a basic understanding of learning, you can look at a situation and immediately see just things go in the wrong order a lot of the time. You have all the right components in the wrong order and you get a very different outcome. And that, at least it gave me that sort of change in philosophy, that the components matter less than the order of the components, especially the outcomes.
It's a great place to finish. Thank you very much, Dr. Kashey. Yes. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah,
it was
thank
awesome.
you so much for having me. Yes,
thank you very much.
Have a wonderful evening. Yeah.